Hi everyone. My name is Alex, followed by my co-host Matt, Sam, and Joy, and welcome to our superhero comics podcast, where we will be describing and breaking down a couple of different comics today. The first being The Dark Knight Returns, mainly issue one, but we will go into further detail, as well as Marvel's issue zero. And with that, we are going to get started with Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. So whoever wants to start her off.
Sure, I can go. First, we're just going to give a quick plot synopsis of The Dark Knight Returns. At this point in time, Bruce has been retired for, I believe, 10 years. That being Bruce Wayne, who is Batman. And when he's retired, crime has gone up exponentially, but simultaneously, some of his greater foes, like Two Face and Joker, have been rehabilitated. They've been seen by various doctors and have pretty much tried to be acclimated into society. But while those villains have kind of been left in the past, a new group of gangsters called the Mutants have risen and are just ravaging Gotham. And that is the breaking point for Bruce in a way where he has to kind of pick the mantle back up and realize that Gotham needs Batman more than anything at the moment. And after he gets the mantle back up, a whole slew of events occurs. But going from there, I'll pass it off to one of you guys.
So to add to your synopsis, the reason why Bruce Wayne or Batman chose to retire was because one of his Robins, not the first Robin, but the second Robin, actually got killed by the Joker. That was set place 10 years before this comic, and this took a heavy toll on the Batman. So that's why he did choose to retire. And we can see this as well as other traumatic experiences from his past haunt him till this day, even though he's 55 years old. And one panel that we can discuss really quickly is on page 12 of the comic, where Bruce Wayne and Commissioner Jim Gordon is talking in, I believe, in a bar. And Jim Gordon quickly mentions what happened to Jason, which is the second Robin. And immediately Bruce Wayne decides to get up and he decides to leave because it's just a hard topic for him to talk about. And in the description of that same page, he refers to himself as a zombie, a Flying Dutchman, and a dead man 10 years ago. We can see that this shows that the man known as Bruce Wayne kind of died along with Jason Todd 10 years prior to this event. And we can see on the next page, which is page 13, that as he's about to get mugged by two mutant members, they notice that he is not afraid and he is not like retaliating against them. And one of the mutant members says, "I don't know, man. I look at him, he's into it." And to me personally, it kind of made me seem like he's not afraid to die, and he, as Bruce Wayne, is just kind of separated from the world, and he doesn't really care what happens to him at this point. Does anyone else have any thoughts about this panel?
I don't have any thoughts about like that specific panel, but like overall, I think within this like the entirety of this comic book, there is like this inner conflict between Bruce Wayne and Batman. And referencing page 25, we have this inner dialogue between Batman and Bruce, where Batman is like telling Bruce like, "I'm your soul. You cannot escape me." Basically, kind of signifying how much of a central aspect of Batman that is Bruce's identity, and how, as much as he tries to put up a facade of taking vows or promises or drinking alcohol or blaming it on his age, there's something that he can really do to kind of put off this central aspect of who he really is. And I also think on page 25 as well, a specific panel says, "Smoldering, I burn you, burning you, I flare hot, bright, and fierce and beautiful." And I think that kind of just goes to show that Being Batman is a beautiful yet destructive thing, just like fire. It can be beautiful in some cases, but also very destructive. Beautiful in the case that he is fighting crime in a very crime ridden place such as Gotham, but also very destructive as there are moments where he loses control in how he deals with crime. So I overall just think that a lot of these panels just deal with this inner conflict between Batman and Bruce and how they kind of have an influence on one another.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Joy, and I think that's also prevalent in what Matt was saying on page 13 as well, because it shows Bruce having a very like calm state of mind despite, meeting the mutants for the first time, and uh in a way it kind of feels like the city of Gotham kind of forgot who Batman was because although there's never been like a quote unquote face to him except for a few people that did know uh who he was um, like people don't associate this 55-year-old man being quote unquote Batman that 10 years ago would save the city no matter the price or whatnot. And I think it's important to note that when he's like confronted by these mutants, he's analyzing them in the sense of trying to figure out if there's an actual problem already within the city, which he has an idea and sense of for, but ultimately him not being I guess shook by the mutants, uh, and that's what like him holding his ground. That's what makes them eventually leave.
Yeah. Just to bounce off that point, um, for like 10 years, Gotham has almost like forgotten what it's like a certain sense of fear, right? Where just like a normal street gang like this, like almost couldn't exist without with the fear of knowing that like this giant bat creature could descend upon you. And like that almost plays off how like Batman as a character, an entity within his own universe, has almost become legend, where he's not Bruce Wayne is not just a man anymore, right? He's very large in stature. He towers over everyone else that he's standing next to. He's incredibly strong and intelligent, and just by the sheer resources, he's kind of done everything shy of being just a normal person, right? And you kind of see how that has like affected like the people that he's gone against, right? I think it's the psychiatrist later on that mentions like the toll that he takes on his victims in a way.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. And we can see this effect on a lot of people during the film. I mean, not the film, the comic, my bad. And a lot of citizens in the comic see him as dangerous as his enemies are. And if anything goes wrong, he can be just as bad as them. So there is a split um, conflict in the comic where one side favors him as a vigilante, while the other sees him just as another criminal that isn't actually helping society, but is actually causing more problems, like the psychiatrist, as well as the conversation between the two people on the news TV station.
Yeah, it's great that you brought that up, Matt, because throughout the comic we see that there's almost these juxtaposed panels of news reporters and debates going on that the news station hosts, where we see two opposing arguments being made that is not the most subtle way to deliver kind of the author's little
Message.
intentions. Yeah, his message. But throughout the panels, we see different viewpoints of, well, he's never killed anyone. Well, he's never um, like caused anyone to intentionally die. Right? It's never been his direct influence that's killed someone, but it's like the morality of is him saving someone in the moment worth the long term repercussions.
I definitely agree with you that there is a huge presence of news in this comic, and I recalled on page 24 that that's exactly how Bruce Wayne and the Batman's relationship kind of got to an all time high was when he was watching TV, and as he flipped through the channels, he kept seeing violent like reports on TV, as well as I believe it was a show that reminded him of his parents' death, which brought that trauma back. I believe 40 years from the point of this comic. So we do see a big big role of news, which could connect to how important news is today, or how news was during the '90s when this comic was written.
And speaking on the pass that you just mentioned, I thought it was like interesting how on page 16 the bat idea is reintroduced, how he breaks through the window. I think it's very symbolic in the moment because there's like a moment of self doubt as you see within like the first four upper panels. He's his facial expressions and his hands and like are like the bat just coming in through the window represents, I guess, in a way of him returning to Gotham in a sense, and I think that's like a major theme that is going to start to, or not going to start, but had started to play while reading this comic.
You could say that in the beginning, you could say that Batman was a vessel for Bruce Wayne, or I mean, I'm sorry, you could say that, yeah, but then now you could say that Bruce Wayne was a vessel for Batman, in a sense,
Absolutely.
if that makes sense.
I just wanted to quickly circle back to page 25. I kind of agree with what Matt said when like the importance of media. As we saw like throughout the entire comic book, like there were a lot of like polarized opinions on Batman and how through this form of media it really controlled public opinion about him. But we also see the power of media when it came to like reporting crime and how much of an impact that had on Bruce. On page 24, we see like quick cuts between like his terrified face to what the news is saying and then back to his terrified face and how much of an effect that has on him and how like it contributes to a very like quick build up to like his breaking point where he eventually does go back to being Batman, which is signified with the bat breaking through the window. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, to stay on that page 25 for another minute, um, Frank Miller, the author of this comic, always does a great job with how he portrays light versus color and that contrast, um, especially with how The Dark Knight Returns has a very subdued color palette, where there's a lot of panels that don't have as bright colors, or they don't have as bright um, like just lighting in general. And there's a lot of like darker, more black and white type panels. So when you do see those vibrant colors, that vibrant like panel, it really stands out on the page.
And I think that that artistic choice to keep it dark more or less represents all the issues going on in Gotham. Because when there is that panel of vibrant color, and it obviously it does stick out, like you said, Sam, it really makes you think twice about like how what you were just reading before was very dreary or very, as you've been saying, absent of color.
Yeah, but also I agree because during the time, if you also look at Superman comics, you can see Metropolis as a very bright and colorful city with tons of tall buildings. But Gotham, especially in this comic, you can see it as it not being a very safe place to live, and you're always looking over your shoulder if you're a citizen.
I just found it interesting how the threat of the mutants was the idea for this comic. It's more or less gang violence in a way, and Bruce is a vigilante, or Batman rather, well both, is like tasked with having to deal with that on top of public opinion. Like if we're gonna rotate it back to the media stuff, because he's never obviously in the spotlight of it all. Like he never wants to make it seem like it's him until people like spot him.
Yeah, having it almost the central villain be like a gang, it grounds it much more in reality. A lot of Batman type villains could be a little like stretch of reality, with some exceptions, of course. The Joker is just an absolutely crazy psycho, and we'll talk about his appearance later on. But like having a gang be the central villain makes it much more grounded in reality and brings Bruce down to a much more like human level opposed to that mythological status he held 10 years prior.
Yeah, I do believe also because they kind of focus just on the gang in this first part because not just this, but also like in the anniversary comic, but also in the movies, this story is split up into two parts. With this first part focusing on him and the mutants, and then the ending of the second part is focused on him and his relationship with Superman. And we'll go into that later, but I do believe that it is smart to just focus on this in the beginning because they have to set up his story with him returning after 40 years and how when he puts the suit back on, he stated in one panel how he felt like he was 20 or 30, how he was that age that he felt like he was. And I feel like that was really smart of the author because then he could go into a more supernatural and kind of a difficult conflict to kind of wrap your head around. So yeah.
Um, I also thought that, as Alex said, like him battling the mutant gang, but also battling the media. Uh, I feel like with superheroes, there's always this trope that like there's good guys and there's bad guys, and the good always defeats evil. But with this, we like see almost a sense of nuance where like even though Batman is deemed a superhero because he does beat bad guys, we also see that like he's not seen as a good guy to everyone. And to many people, he's seen as a bad guy, and even to I believe it was Superman, who was also a fellow superhero, also deemed him kind of like almost an outlier of like the superhero community because of his practices. So I thought it was interesting that like even within like I guess the good guy community, there are some like people that are in like a lower level or considered outliers.
Yeah, I think Superman, I think an issue 4 later talks about how Bruce has taken on this holy crusade with this holy war again, and that's going to be the final straw because at this point in the DC universe, we find out that all members of the Justice League and most of the superheroes have in some way been regulated by the government, right? Where like Superman is only able to continue being a superhero, but only under the government's thumb, right? So there's almost this like zero tolerance for superheroes, right? And Batman has kind of transcended the face of stopping crime, where it's the simple fear that he exists would prevent it. But with the mutants, there's been such a time gap that that fear is no longer present, right? I think at one point there's a police officer who's a little bit more veteran, and his partner is kind of a rookie, and the veteran police officer is like, "Oh, you're in for a show," when they know Batman's back, right? Because the simple knowledge that Batman exists is preventing crime, right? But now that he's back, it's kind of changes that dynamic.
Yeah, they even said like there was like a panel that was like the news, and they're like most like kids nowadays think that like Batman is a myth or like a legend and he's not even real anymore. And like talk in terms of like the criminals, there's another panel that like mentioned criminals saying like, oh, there's no way he can beat us, he's not even real, and even if he is real, he's like 50 years old, there's no way that like he stands a chance. So that whole like gap where like he just was no longer around definitely contributed to like the rise in crime, but also the rise in like people just like not really believing his existence anymore.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said, and also with how at this point he was kind of going against the government, and we do see how later other superhero comics do the same with Civil War and Marvel about how one side doesn't want to be controlled by the government and the other does. So that also kind of makes you think about which side you would be on if you were a superhero. Because on one hand, if you were with the government, you'd have to show your identity, which would put your fellow loved ones in danger, and also you might have to do things that you don't want to. Like for example, this was in the movie. I'm not sure if it was in the comic, but Superman actually attacked a bunch of Russian ships, and I believe he did kill a bunch of them. So you could see Superman being a villain in some people's eyes, or I might be mistaken if he didn't kill anyone. But
I believe in the comic he only went as far as to divert a an EMP missile, electromagnetic pulse, which wipes out all electronics for a few days. Um, and he ends up being very injured by that. But I don't believe in the comic he kills anyone.
So I wanted to bring back the idea of the Joker now because we had talked about the idea of crime rising because everyone forgot who Batman was and is seen as a myth. The Joker comes to fruition because he is granted access to leave the psychiatric ward he is kept up in, or mental hospital. I don't know the exact terminology. That he's kept up in, and he's given the opportunity to present himself to the public on a form in which gives him millions of like views. So this idea of gaining more media access allows the Joker to, um, want to commit this next crime that hopefully someone wants to talk about a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how Joker, without the knowledge that Batman still existed, had no purpose. Without that yang to his yin, right? That kind of like they can't exist without the other, really made him lose all motivation and wanting to continue his kind of crime spree, if you will. Because, like, if Batman tries to bring order by the simple existence of him in Gotham, Joker is that chaos that just will do anything to attract the opposite.
yeah, and that's true with this as well as other appearances of the Joker. And they have a relationship where one cannot really live without the other. Because for the Joker, his goal, in my opinion, is to show that Batman is just as crazy as he is and would go to crazy lengths. Which is why at the end of the film, or at the end of the comic, or at the end of their conflict, Batman is faced with a choice whether to kill the Joker or not. And ultimately, Batman chooses not to. And Joker just wants to prove that he will. And in fact, he actually snaps his own neck. But that's a little far ahead. So I think I would actually go back to his plan earlier in the comic, where what essentially happened was when he was at the talk show and he was speaking to the audience as well as the talk show host, he announced that he was actually going to kill everyone in the room. And in fact, what happened was he released his Joker gas, which, if you don't know, causes a person to laugh uncontrollably until they suffocate and die, which is what happened. So he killed a couple hundred people in that room.
Yeah, I find it kind of intriguing how the dichotomy that like this is almost this whole comic is built around Batman's failures, where Jason Todd, the Robin, who who died at the hands of Joker, was the reason that Bruce went into retirement. Um, and at the same time, Batman failed to keep the crime rate down, and that brings him back out of retirement. And he's reminded of his failures with how he wasn't able to rehabilitate the Joker or Two Face, and he wasn't able to justify having his no kill mentality because that is a pillar of the Batman character where he will never kill regardless of the situation. and he's now at a point in his character where he is like fantasizing about ending the Joker's life, something that up until this point would have been madness for him to even consider.
Yes, and also there was another panel in this comic that kind of proves that point because there was one point where a mutant gang, like I believe it was three mutant gang members, kidnapped a child of someone important, and the woman said to Batman, "Take another step and I'll kill the boy. Believe me." And Batman actually did shoot her, but it was off. It was off camera, and he says, "I do believe you." So that does kind of show that Batman has changed a lot since his younger years, and it is eating him up inside. But even after all of that suffering and all of that changed, he actually did stick to his morals in the end and didn't kill the Joker, which I think is which is interesting.
I think one of the last things I wanted to talk about when it came to Batman was page 55, where he's face to face with Harvey Dent, otherwise known as Two Faced. And I think we see a parallel between the two of them of Bruce trying to suppress Batman or Harvey trying to suppress Two Face, but both failing in the end. One part specifically says the scars go deep, too deep, and I feel like that just shows that like trying to hide such an essential aspect of who you are is like it goes skin deep, and it's not really something that can be covered by surgery or facade or vows. If it's such a strong part of who you are, the more you try to suppress it, the stronger it's going to appear when it eventually comes.
And I do think the lighting on that same panel or that same page does strengthen that point. Sorry, I just stuttered a bit. And when he said a reflection, his face got covered by the darkness, so that's kind of showing his like inner self in a way, just kind of like how in the photo before that it showed like a picture of a bat. So you could say that that is his inner struggle that he tries to hide whenever he puts on the costume.
Absolutely, and I agree. But I think that the idea of the inner struggle can also be seen in our second comic that we're going to talk about today, which again is Marvel's issue 0. In a brief synopsis, it follows Phineas Thomas Horton, who's a scientist described as the greatest of his time, and in the comic it depicts that his son is like part of his experiments, which we later find out he has a quote unquote ability, and we will go into that while we discuss it. Basically, it's told through the son's point of view, so it's all narrated by him, and it's a relatively short comic, but it does provide a lot of internal battles and thoughts from his point of view. So, if someone wants to take it away, let's start with this one.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really interesting about the main character's design and kind of bleeds into the art style a little bit is how, of course, now that we've moved on from Batman, but Batman has this kind of like really good secrecy of like no one knows who he is, but in Marvel it's impossible to not know simply because of his design. It's this flaming red, like crimson red person who's walking around with no coverings, and the art style does a great job of exemplifying that, where it almost looks like watercolors in a way in some panels, where colors bleed from one into the other, and really adding a vibrancy while keeping that like detail of like adding an extra punch to every panel where it's like a shadow composed on his face, right? So there's no hiding who he is.
I also liked the sequencing of the wording as well. They're not like put in their own little respective boxes, but they're kind of like floating out throughout the the panel or the overall page. And rather than reading from like left to right, or more so reading the narration from top to bottom. So I thought that was also interesting as a choice.
Oh yes, I do agree with that for sure. And I do also feel like this is very interesting because of the fact that his father, or I mean Johnny's father, shows him off to the public as some sort of like caged animal. He is encapsulated in, I believe, a glass tube that's see through, so the audience can still see him, and he is unable to hurt them. And in my mind, I just thought of of someone showing off like the 10th or ninth wonder of the world and not his son. And I feel like that is dehumanizing, and it could have gone much better.
Right. We see that on like that scene is portrayed on page 7, and what's so interesting about that is there's a great panel on the bottom of the page where um, kind of the mid 20th century aesthetic of the comic is perfectly seen with all the reporters having very like timely outfit on, and all the shadow is portrayed on the back of them with the light from the camera being the only source of light in the panel, except for Johnny, the main character of the comic, right, where he's that vibrant and that um, red in comparison to the rest of the frame.
Right, and I wanted to bring this sort of back to both Matt and Sam's points. I think this idea of kind of losing the father-son relationship is very prevalent in this scene on page 7. It's like Matt said, he looks like he's as a caged animal. He could also be compared to like a museum exhibit. He's not being treated as like a human, but rather, like Matt said again, an experiment or a product of genius of this man's scientific brilliance.
Also on page 7, I also think it's interesting to not only focus on the father-son relationship, but also like the general public first being introduced to the concept of like a superhero or something that is so different from them. I feel like it kind of portrays the idea that we as humans fear things that we don't understand, and within that fear, we have retaliation, which is probably one of the reasons, or the primary reason why they decided to bury him in the ground.
Oh, for sure. And to add some more context to that point, even though he did get buried, his father found a way to get him to learn about many different things while he was being trapped in a sort of prison. And although it can be seen as a good thing, based on his dialogue, especially on pages 9 and 10, respectively, he notes that even though he was aware and he learns about everything, he still isn't able to experience things like a normal human would, which really was shocking to me. And for example, like if he learns about a cake, for example, he'll know about it, but he won't actually eat it or touch it, so he won't know what it is to eat a cake. And also that made me think that even though he is a superhero, he could have easily become a villain, just just as easily because of how he was treated, not just by society, but by his own father.
I also thought that there was like almost a parallel between him and Batman. Um, Bruce suppressed Batman because of his own doing, like he chose to do that. But in this case, the son was suppressed because of society as well as his father. So having both of their identities suppressed and seeing that parallel, but because of two different reasons and two different factors, was something that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, another great parallel between the two characters is their relationship with their father. Throughout The Dark Knight Returns, we see this one panel repeated of Bruce's father being gunned down, which is essential to his origin story of being traumatized by seeing his two parents his mother and his father being gunned down in front of him, right? And there's always that guilt that he carries with him, there that like inescapable like fear of knowing that like he was powerless to do something about it, and that like mission to never be that powerless again. And then we see that contrast with the father in Marvels, where he has all the power to help his son or to let him be this pariah, this like attraction for the world to see. So it's almost a complete opposite relationship of dependency versus um, codependency in a way.
Absolutely, and I think you bring up a great point about that. Um, but it looks like we're almost out of time here on our show today. There's been notable comparisons between Batman and Johnny, which is I don't even know Professor, but um, Phineas's son. But yeah, bat- uh, superheroes are completely vastly different in their own sense, but remarkably they do draw comparisons between stories and alike, as we've shown today. Um, we want to thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.